In 2006, deep inside Spain's archive of Simancas, a lost royal investigation surfaced, 48 pages, sealed in the paperwork of empire, about Christopher Columbus's rule on Hispaniola, not from modern critics looking back. From the empire that financed him, rewarded him, and sent him across the Atlantic. And inside that paperwork is the reversal. In 1500, Columbus was not welcomed home as a triumphant admiral. He was arrested, stripped of power on the island, shipped back to Spain in chains. That image cuts against the familiar portrait: Columbus the navigator, the discoverer, the symbol. Spain still wanted conquest, gold, conversion, and control. So what did Columbus do on Hispaniola that made even that empire decide he had become too dangerous to keep in power? But the document only becomes more disturbing once the rules of the case are clear. This is not a story where the Spanish crown becomes a modern court of human rights. The monarchs who backed Columbus wanted an empire that produced wealth, expanded Christianity, claimed territory, and stayed under royal command. Gold mattered, obedience mattered. A colony that could feed itself, pay for itself, and not collapse into rebellion mattered. That is what makes the chains hard to explain. If Columbus had been harsh, in a way that protected those interests, the system had many reasons to look away. What the Bobadilla file suggests is more dangerous to Spain's own project. A governor whose violence, family rule, and mismanagement were turning Hispaniola into a political and economic liability. The document matters because it comes from inside that system. But it is not a clean window. Francisco de Bobadilla, the man sent to investigate Columbus, also arrived with authority to replace him. The testimonies he gathered must be read with that pressure in mind. So the case splits into three pieces: the myth of Columbus as only a navigator, the document recording complaints against his rule, and the consequence: removal, arrest, and a voyage home in chains. To connect them, we have to leave the archive and return to Hispaniola after 1492. In 1492, Columbus reached the Caribbean and claimed lands for the Spanish crown. On Hispaniola, the large island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the expedition began turning into something more permanent: a colony. The voyage had become a job of rule. The famous image is the navigator at sea, reading wind and stars. But after the first voyage, the crown's expectations pulled him into a different role. Columbus became admiral, but also governor, administrator, judge, and enforcer over a settlement that had to prove Spain's gamble was worth it. Hispaniola was not an empty stage waiting for Europe. It was home to Taíno communities with villages, leaders, food systems, trade networks, and political relationships. Spanish authority arrived as an outside claim laid over a living world. From Spain's point of view, Hispaniola had to deliver several things at once. It had to produce gold, or at least the promise of it. It had to display Christian conversion as part of the crown's sacred mission. It had to anchor Spain's territorial claim against rivals. And it had to remain orderly enough that ships, settlers, supplies, and royal authority could keep moving across the ocean. Those goals put pressure on the colony from the beginning. Gold became proof that the voyages had meaning. Labor became the mechanism by which the colony survived and paid for itself. Obedience became the test of whether Columbus could rule. On a clean map, the plan looked simple: Spain, route, island, colony. On Hispaniola, those labels became hunger, gold quotas, forced labor, resentment, and resistance. The route line had ended. The colonial pressure system was beginning. On Hispaniola, pressure became daily survival. Who ate, who worked, who found gold, and who was punished when promises sent back to Spain did not match what the island could produce. For Spanish settlers, the colony was not the reward many had imagined. Food was scarce. Disease moved through the settlement. Men who had crossed the Atlantic expecting wealth found themselves hungry, unpaid, and trapped under a governor who answered frustration with discipline. Some deserted, some rebelled, some sent complaints across the ocean because Columbus's version of empire was failing them. For Taíno communities, the same system was far more devastating. Villages were pulled into tribute demands, labor drafts, searches for gold, and violence after resistance or shortfall. European disease added another force no one on the island had immunity against. The result was not only political disorder, it was the beginning of human collapse. Columbus tried to hold this system together through fear. Harsh punishment became a message to everyone watching: obey, produce, submit. That may have created moments of control, but it also deepened resentment and made the colony harder to govern. By the late 1490s, Hispaniola was a royal investment sliding toward chaos. Spaniards were accusing Columbus of tyranny and mismanagement. Indigenous communities were being forced through catastrophe at the center of the colony's economy. And every ship carrying complaints back to Spain turned local failure into a problem for the crown. So the response was not a public moral awakening, it was procedural. If the admiral could not keep the island profitable, obedient, and politically contained, the monarchy would send someone with authority to investigate him and, if necessary, replace him. By 1500, the complaints had a royal name attached to them: Francisco de Bobadilla. Bobadilla was not sent to Hispaniola as a traveler, missionary, or curious observer. He arrived in 1500 with authority from the Spanish crown to investigate disorder on the island and take control if Columbus had failed. The monarchy was no longer asking Columbus to explain himself from afar. It was sending a man across the Atlantic with power to hear accusations, judge the situation on the ground, and replace the admiral at the center of it. The document rediscovered in 2006 came out of this official intervention. Bobadilla gathered testimony from 23 Spanish colonists, people who had lived inside Columbus's rule, and described what they said they had seen, suffered, or heard. The file is powerful. It is also pressured. Bobadilla was not neutral. His mission gave him power, and Columbus's removal strengthened Bobadilla's own position. A report that justified replacing Columbus also justified the man doing the replacing. Some witnesses may have had grudges, some may have wanted to protect themselves, shift blame, or win favor with the new authority. In a colony fractured by hunger, rebellion, punishment, and failed promises, testimony was never gathered under neutral conditions. So the honest way to read the Bobadilla report is as an official record produced through political pressure, and that is why it is revealing. The Spanish crown did not need modern humanitarian language to be alarmed. It needed signs that its governor had lost control, that his methods were turning colonists against him, and that the colony meant to generate wealth was becoming a liability. By the time Bobadilla finished, the case against Columbus was strong enough that the admiral who had crossed the ocean for Spain was arrested and sent back across that same ocean in chains. Now the question narrows. What did those 23 testimonies actually allege? The testimonies do not read like legend. They read like a file: acts, punishments, witnesses, consequences. One allegation concerns a Spanish colonist accused of stealing corn, not gold, not weapons, but food, in a colony where hunger had become part of the political landscape. The punishment recorded in the investigation was severe bodily mutilation, carried out as an example to others. Another testimony describes a woman who criticized the Columbus family, not an armed rebel or enemy commander, but someone accused of speaking against those in power. According to the report, she was publicly humiliated and then punished with violence meant to silence her. The scenes do not need spectacle to show what they meant. In Bobadilla's file, punishment was not only a response to crime, it was a language of government. Steal food, and the colony learns fear. Insult the admiral's household, and the settlement learns where speech ends. Disobey, complain, resist, or embarrass the ruling family, and the answer could be staged in public, where punishment became a message. These are allegations gathered by a man with every reason to justify Columbus's removal. That caution matters, but the pattern matters too. The accusations are specific, repeated, and tied to the daily mechanics of rule. What emerges is not merely a harsh governor in a harsh century. It is a colony managed through terror, while the man at the center claimed royal authority to do it. And that forces the next question. Were these isolated cruelties, or evidence that Columbus had become impossible for Spain itself to control? This is where the file turns. It is not only a record of cruelty, it is a record of failure. If the crown had only discovered violence on Hispaniola, that alone would not explain the full force of its reaction. Spain was not stepping away from conquest. It was not abandoning extraction, forced labor, conversion, or imperial control. The monarchy wanted the colony to produce wealth, obey royal command, and prove that the Atlantic gamble could be governed. Columbus was supposed to deliver that. Instead, Bobadilla's testimony pointed to a colony where fear had not produced order, it had produced instability. Spaniards were rebelling or threatening rebellion. Food was scarce, gold expectations were being missed or fought over. Authority was split between Columbus and his brothers, and complaints were traveling back across the ocean faster than profit. So the accusations of brutality did not sit in a separate moral column from the accusations of misrule. They fed the same conclusion: a governor who mutilated, humiliated, and executed to keep control was also a governor who had failed to keep control. That is what makes the report so damaging. Columbus was not being judged by a modern court, or by later historians applying values he never encountered. He was being judged by the empire that had armed him with titles, ships, and authority. Even inside that brutal system, he had become too costly, too unpredictable, too dangerous to leave in command. The chains placed on Columbus in 1500 were not the end of Spanish violence in the Caribbean. They were the crown's decision that this particular man, in this particular office, had become a liability to empire. But if we stop at the arrest, we miss the larger wreckage. The deepest consequences were measured on Hispaniola, among the people forced to live inside the system he helped create. On Hispaniola, that liability had already left damage no royal pardon could undo. For the Taino communities who had first met the Spanish ships in 1492, the catastrophe was not a single event. It came in layers: tribute demands, forced labor, enslavement, warfare, hunger, displacement, and diseases against which indigenous people had no prior immunity. Historians still debate the starting population of Hispaniola because the surviving numbers are uneven and politically charged, but the direction is not debated. Within a few decades, a population that had sustained towns, farms, kinship networks, ceremonies, and political leadership across the island had collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. That is what the royal paperwork cannot contain. The crown could remove a governor, reassign offices, issue instructions, and send another official across the Atlantic. But the system Columbus helped build had already turned Hispaniola into a place where indigenous life was measured against gold, labor, obedience, and Spanish survival. Columbus himself was not erased from history in 1500. The monarchs had him released after his return to Spain, and in 1502 they allowed him to sail again on a fourth voyage. But they did not restore him as governor of Hispaniola. The office that had made him admiral, viceroy, and colonial ruler was broken away from him. That fracture carried into his family. After his death, his heirs fought the Spanish crown in the long legal battles known as the Pleitos Colombinos, pressing claims to the titles, privileges, and wealth promised in the first contracts. The argument moved from island settlements and royal orders into court records. What had Columbus been owed? What had the crown taken back? And how much of his empire could pass to his descendants? Those lawsuits show the aftershock of Columbus's removal. Columbus's legacy did not settle into triumph. It splintered into demographic ruin, revoked authority, disputed contracts, and a family still trying to collect on promises attached to a colony that had already devastated the people living there. So when the legal papers fold back into the archive, the question becomes sharper. What can this rediscovered report prove about the man his own empire decided it could no longer trust? The file leaves us with no perfect window into the past, but with a document that cannot be brushed aside. Bobadilla had power to gain from making Columbus look unfit. The witnesses he gathered were Spanish colonists, not a full record of every person harmed on Hispaniola. Their testimony passed through politics, rivalry, and royal interest. Still, the parchment is real, the investigation is real, the arrest was real. Long before Columbus became a symbol argued over by later centuries, his own imperial system wrote down accusations of terror, disorder, and failed rule. Spain did not need to be innocent for its judgment to matter. That is what makes the evidence so severe. A brutal empire looked at one of its own architects and decided he had become too dangerous, too unstable, and too costly to leave in command. So the honest picture is not the schoolbook navigator, and not a cartoon villain outside history. It is a man who crossed an ocean, became a colonial governor, and helped build a system that brought catastrophe to Hispaniola. When the archive drawer closes, the myth does not disappear, but it no longer stands alone. What history hid was already in the file,